Matt Roberts with D1 Ticker. Excited to be joined by Floyd Street's finest, one of the most connected media guys here in the Derby City. Jeff Greer, how are you, Jeff?
I'm great. How are you, Matt?
Doing wonderful. So obviously what's sort of top of mind for most fans around town is the men's basketball hire. But clearly for our audience, what's more of interest is where does the University of Louisville go with their AD search and their eventual AD hire? Let's start with this, Jeff. A lot of folks in the national media, a lot of folks here locally are pointing to Kenny Payne as the potential selection as the men's basketball coach, a decision that, or an announcement that hypothetically could happen as soon as this week once Louisville is out of the ACC tournament. If the Cards end up going with Kenny Payne and Josh Heird, the interim AD, makes that decision, what will that indicate to you on Josh's candidacy for the permanent AD role?
That's a great question. There's a lot to unpeel there. And Matt, as you know, Louisville is a very complicated situation in general with the athletics department and the university. I think there is a strong contingent of former players who primarily contributed to the teams that really made Louisville basketball what it is today in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Who are strongly vouching for Kenny Payne to be Louisville's next head coach. I don't know how much sway that will be, but it's certainly created a lot of pressure on interim athletics director Josh Heird. A couple of the big names of those former players have roles in finding the next athletics director, but have also apparently reportedly suggested that they would like Kenny Payne to be the next head coach. So it's fair to wonder if one thing is connected to the other. All I would say is, based on the reporting that I have done and some of the relationships that I have around the athletics department and around the university, I firmly believe that Josh Heird is in a position where he is going to do what he thinks is best for the university. And he will then use whatever that situation is. He wants to be the athletics director permanently, full-time, whatever phrase you want to use at U of L. But he's not going to just make a hire that he thinks will get him the job. He's going to make a hire that he thinks will be the best thing for the university. And if that impacts his chances of being the permanent athletics director, so be it on his end. I would like to think that there are enough people at U of L who believe in that same approach, that they would not say, oh, he didn't hire this coach, or specifically Kenny Payne, so he's not a candidate for the permanent job anymore. I think there would be enough, as I like to say, adults in the room to be able to look past that and make the decision on other things that might outweigh that hire. And make the decision again that they also believe is for the best for the university. So I'd like to think that it's not a factor, but it's hard to not feel that pressure. Even being me, not involved in all of it, it's hard to not feel that pressure.
Sure. And a couple of other data points let's talk through as well. There is not a permanent president. Laura Gonzalez, of course, is the interim president. Do we know anything more about the search for that position and how it could relate to the AD search as well?
Well, it's funny that you say that, Matt, because when we got to the point during the basketball season where even right before the basketball season, and for our listeners, if you might not remember this, but Chris Mack was suspended, the former men's basketball coach at Louisville was suspended before the season for 6 games. He was suspended, I think it was like August or September when it was announced, and there were some rumblings starting that, he might be on the hot seat at Louisville if they don't have a great season when he comes back. Obviously, things went south very quickly. But the reason I bring that up is the conversation back then was, is he going to be dismissed? And a lot of people were saying probably not, because the University of Louisville did not have a president in place. They did not have an athletics department or athletics director, in place by the time those rumblings really ramped up in like December and into January. So the thought was, find a president, then you find the AD, then the AD goes out and hires a men's basketball coach. And in that timeline, you would think that would be like 2023, right? That the timeline wouldn't add up. with the way we normally think about how universities get going. It's been the exact inverse.
Right.
Chris Mack came to U of L and basically said, I want out. Josh Heird, the interim athletics director, negotiated that. They started the process for hiring the coach, who will be hired by Josh Heird, the interim athletics director. And they haven't even announced yet the search firm to hire the AD. So if it's taking this long to do athletics work, Lord knows the university president search is going to take even longer. We all know how universities operate. They want to be very fastidious with what they're doing. They want to make sure it's a thorough search. So I would imagine that we're still very much in the early stages of finding a permanent university president, in addition to finding a permanent athletics director at U of L.
Well, what do you make of the connection between DHR handling the Florida State search that Vince Tyree was clearly involved in to some degree? That didn't pan out for Vince or for Florida State. Mike Alford's, of course, installed in Tallahassee. DHR is now also assisting Josh and U of L with the men's basketball search. I'm not sure what to make of this gray area.
Look, we know this from being around college athletics for a long time, and just universities in general, that there's a lot of weird feet being placed in weird wells. It's just so the buckets are constantly mixing water, whatever phrase you want to use. It's not. It is on its face. You're like, yeah, that's kind of weird. But when you get into the brass tacks of it, okay, yeah, it starts to kind of just be like, maybe they can separate that whole situation from this one. Search firms in general have a lot of conflicts of interest. And I know I'm a University of Pittsburgh alum. I could point to the search that resulted in Kevin Stallings being hired as the men's basketball coach. The search firm that found him and brought him, or helped bring him to Pittsburgh, also then, I believe the story goes, was involved with the AD, who then left very briefly after that. And Pittsburgh ended up having to kind of get rid of all of that like 2 years later because of that whole situation. So search firms get involved in a lot of different ways. They have a lot of different clients. They're on the outset, you might say, yeah, there's some conflicts of interest there. But the way it was painted to me was for the men's basketball coach. They are asking DHR to basically vet candidates. They're not going to go out and find a candidate. They're not going to say, this is who you should hire. They're going to help Josh Heird say, here are some fits that we found. We did some vetting. We did maybe some interviewing and some research. Here are some candidates that you might want to consider. But Josh Heird, I can tell you this, is a really sharp young guy in athletics, has worked in just about every job in athletics. And so I would think that he's going to work with the search firm, but this is very much going to be his decision. And I think that allows you to get a little bit more of that separation of maybe where that previous conflict of interest might have been.
Sure. Another constituency that we haven't talked about yet, but is really crucial in this whole process is the Board of Trustees, which has turned over quite significantly in the last handful of years. What role do you perceive the board playing in any of these three hires, but specific to the AD search, of course, that is upcoming at some point?
I think it's massive. I mean, the Board of Trustees, obviously, if people aren't familiar with the University of Louisville situation, there's been a significant turnover in the last 5-6 years. They had a whole new board basically put into place by the governor. It was a rather controversial situation when it happened. It still kind of has left a lot of people upset with the previous governor of the state of Kentucky, or the Commonwealth of Kentucky, I'm sorry. But they will be very active in all of this. Obviously, the biggest one is going to be hiring the university president and vetting candidates through that. I'm sure they'll create committees and have a search firm help there. So it'll be a narrow focus for a time. But that Board of Trustees is a very important part of everything U of L does. They will probably, I would assume, the way that the situation will go, I would assume that they'll have at least a say in the men's basketball coach hiring. The other organization that matters a lot in all of this is the University of Louisville Athletics Association. They also have, there's been some crossover between members of those two organizations, and I believe there still is in some cases, but those groups will then have subcommittees that will take part in certain elements of all of this. It's called EULA locally, the Athletic Association. That group also has created a committee that will be a part of the athletics director search and vetting candidates there. I believe it's a couple of alums, it's a couple coaches. There's a variety of people involved in that. So it's all connected, and the trustees will play a major role, I would think, in all three of these very, very important hires. The last thing I would just say real quick for our listeners, I'm sure people know this. If you're in athletics around the country at college athletics, you know this, but there is no bigger job in the city of Louisville than the head men's basketball coach. So you better believe that the Board of Trustees for the university is going to be involved, at least in some way, shape, or form. Even if it's just behind the scenes of having an opinion on it, they will be involved in all of these things. But when there's such a big investment from the university, they have a very important role in all of this.
Yeah, the power dynamics here in town over the last couple of years have been nothing short of interesting and enthralling to try to dig into and understand who's calling what shot. In closing, Jeff, no matter who the men's basketball coach is, what will Josh Heird and or the new AD in the coming months need to do to reestablish the brand with the fan base and sort of regain some momentum specifically in men's basketball?
Okay, so there's a couple things out of that conversation, and this is a really precarious position, I think, that the University of Louisville is in, especially in the men's basketball situation. I think there's plenty of opportunity. The ceiling is obviously extremely high to be one of the highest grossing, most well-known brands in college basketball, which then leads the athletics department typically at U of L. But a couple things have to happen. One, I think there's way too many cooks in the kitchen at U of L. There's too many people who think that they should have a say in decision-making at the university, whether that's through their donations or whatever it is. I think Josh Heird has done a really good job just using this men's basketball search as an example of keeping things very close to his chest and being in charge of it. And that's an important step in all of this to avoid the leaks, because that has been a real problem at U of L over years and years, is the toxicity that's generated from the drip of information that people don't really want getting out. The other thing that I think is important, they're digging out of some financial challenges. I mean, if you just look at their two most recent big buyouts that they've had to pay between Bobby Petrino and $14 million that he was paid to go away after failing here in his second run as a football coach, and Chris Mack, who had the negotiated buyout of $4.8 million. Administrators out there know this. That's not just $18.8 million. There's $16.8 million worth of that is going to be taxed at 20%. So it's actually much bigger than just the $18.8 million. So he's got to get some cash flow back into the university. Very last thing I would say real quick is got to get the NIL stuff in order, get a plan going forward for that. And as part of that, if you're U of L, you absolutely positively have to stay out of the headlines in recruiting stuff and getting in trouble in any way, shape, or form. And Josh Heird has already really significantly hammered that message to his athletics department. So I think people are kind of starting to get in that direction. So even if it's not him, he'll be able to hand that baton off to someone to keep running with it. But there's a lot of work, but I think this is a very important year for Louisville. And I think they've got an opportunity to navigate some choppier waters and get to a safer place.
You know, listen, the reality, and I've come back to this a number of times throughout the last couple of weeks, people in college athletics understand how important the men's basketball hire is for the University of Louisville. People in college athletics understand this is a really wonky situation where you don't have a permanent president, you don't have a permanent AD hiring the most visible and arguably important person at this for this brand in this department. Everything else competitively, other than maybe men's basketball and football, over the last decade is like good to really good. And clearly there's a lot of still financial advantages to this opportunity. So I sort of just find us at this really compelling intersection of an established brand where competitively, most things are going really well. Mm-hmm. The two key revenue sports have some challenges, but then there's this leadership void and you wonder how that's going to work itself out. I need to do a little more research on this, but clearly this is sort of second nature for us. I can't remember a sequence of hires going in this order at a brand of this magnitude. But listen, if the last decade has taught us anything around here, it's like never be surprised, right?
Yeah, Matt, here's a funny anecdote. I'll leave you with this. A local radio news reporter tweeted, name another time that a university had an interim coach, men's basketball coach, an interim athletics director, and an interim president. He tweeted that a couple months ago, and I said, University of Louisville 5 years ago in 2017. So, this is a place that is used to this. But yeah, they've got a lot of really good pieces in place. And I think it's just a matter of making sure that you have strong leadership in place to kind of guide them through some of the final steps, the NCAA process, the infractions process for the men's basketball program. But I would say confidently that I think brighter days are ahead for U of L. And I think this year is going to be really formative in getting them there.
Agreed. Jeff Greer, Floyd Street's finest. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.